Hey everyone, welcome to week 5. We're working through stories you never hear about in the Bible. Again, this is an intentional series that we're using to build up an understanding of how we read Scripture. Right? We're not just reading these crazy stories because we want to read them, although they are fun. We're reading these stories and asking questions to incorporate them in our daily lives. And as we do that, whenever we look to Scripture and ask these questions, we're going to understand a little bit more of what God's trying to tell us. We believe that the Bible should play an authoritative role in our lives. And so in order to really make the most of that, we have to understand how to read the Bible. That's what these questions are for. It helps us to scratch the surface a little bit more and to really begin to cultivate depth in when we read. So this week we're going to be starting the story of Samson. I split Samson's story into 2 weeks because he has so much gold in there. He does so many different things that are just crazy. We kind of know a little bit about Samson and Delilah, but whenever we read more about Samson's life, whenever we understand him, and whenever we see some of these stories that you never hear about, man, let me tell you, it gets crazy. This week we're going to start with Samson's riddle. This is in Judges chapter 14. I'm going to read it and then we'll talk about it. Here's what we read in Scripture in verse 10. His father went down to the woman, and Samson made a feast there as young men were accustomed to do. When the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. And Samson said to them this, "Let me tell you a riddle. If you can explain it to me within 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 festal garments. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 festal garments." And so they said to them, "Ask your riddle. Let us hear it." Here's what he said. "Out of the eater comes something to eat, and out of the strong comes something sweet." But for 3 days they could not explain the riddle. On the 4th day they said to Samson's wife, "Coax your husband to explain the riddle to us, or we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us?" So Samson's wife wept before him, saying, "You hate me. You do not really love me. You have asked a riddle of my people, but you have not explained it to me." He said to her, "Look, I have not told my father or my mother. Why should I tell you?" She wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted, and because she nagged him on the 7th day, he told her. Then she explained the riddle to her people. The men of the town said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, "What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion?" And he said to them, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and he went down to the Ashkelon. He killed 30 men of the town, took their spoil, and gave the festal garments to those who had explained the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. This is just scratching the surface of who Samson was. Samson was really intense. Whenever we look at Samson's life, we see that he is a man that really would be ruled by no one. Right? He kind of paved his own way. He did what was right in his own eyes. That's a common theme that we read about in Judges, but we never see it so prevalently as we do with Samson. In this passage, what we find out is that Samson sees a lion on the way to go meet this woman that he wants to be his wife. And in doing so, he kind of ponders and he thinks about it, and he makes a riddle up about this lion. And he tells his wife's family, he tells his wife's village people, "Look, I'm going to give you this riddle, and if you can figure it out, then I'm going to give you all of these clothes. But if you can't figure it out, then you owe me all of these clothes." A few days pass and they can't figure out the riddle, so they go and they bug his wife, and she eventually nags him and tells him that he needs to tell her. They cheat, they get the answer to the riddle, and Samson is furious, right? So Samson does what none of us would really think about doing, right? He goes and he pays off his end of the bargain, but he does so in a way that is just really intense. He goes to another village and kills all of the men there, takes their clothes, and pays up his end of the bargain, and then he leaves. He goes home and he leaves his wife. Now this is a story that doesn't necessarily directly tie into our lives in any explicit way, right? Samson doesn't just verbally teach us a lesson. In the middle of the story, God doesn't have a commentary. We kind of explains the in and outs and how it relates to our lives, and so what we have to do is kind of wrestle with it. We have to ask questions that we've already asked thus far in the series, and maybe ask a few more. And asking questions and in meditating and dwelling on Scripture, what we'll find is that the answers and the meanings to some of these, the actual practical applications, kind of begin to make their way to the surface a little bit. And so this week, we're going to ask this question. How would I have acted in this story? right? How would I have acted in this story? Now, that may seem like it's a ridiculous question, right? You think, Austin, I've told riddles and jokes before. I've tried to stump people with my dad jokes sometimes, but whenever they cheat and get the answer from someone else, I don't go kill a bunch of villagers. I don't go fight men to get their clothes to pay up a bounty. What do you mean, how would I act in this passage? I wouldn't do any of that. I'm not asking you this question to really figure it out on the external, right? If you were in Samson's shoes, would you have done the same thing? Probably not. Instead, I want you to look inwardly. How would you have acted in this passage? How would you have acted in this story from the context of your heart? Right? Whenever we begin to unfold Scripture, when we begin to look at it and see what the Lord would speak to us through it, what we often get is that He is always speaking to our hearts. As we read in the Gospels, as we observe Jesus' life, He is always about us having the proper heart. Right? And so when we look at this story, whenever we see Samson react the way he did, we see a heart that is very much slanted to doing things the way that I want to do them. Whenever we look at how Samson responded or reacted to this, we can obviously see that it probably wouldn't have been what the Lord would have him do. It probably wouldn't have been the reaction that honored the Lord. But whenever we ask, what would I have done in this passage? Where would your heart have been? As I read it, let me tell you, if somebody cheats me, if somebody lies to me, if somebody is deceptive to me, in my flesh, what I want to do is I want to fight back, right? I don't want to take that. I want to argue. I want to prove them wrong. I want to have justice, right? I want to feel like I have been justified in me being cheated. And let me tell you, as we walk around as Christians, if we're trying to be justified, if we are trying to come out on top every time, then that's not going to honor the Lord, because that shows a heart that is centered on me and not on others, not on the Lord. How would you have reacted to this story? How would you have responded to being cheated, to being deceived? Those things in the heart are really telling, especially in high-stress situations like this. The things that are in our heart are revealed, and they really show where we are at and those areas in our lives that need to be improved on. So we're not going to end there, though. As we have been doing in this series, we've been looking at some element of Jesus' ministry, His life, His teachings. We've been looking at Jesus, and we've been wrestling through some of these questions in your small groups. I would encourage you to continue to do the same. I hope those conversations are going great. Taylor and I's small group has been phenomenal so far. But as you wrestle this out, don't be afraid of being wrong. Don't be afraid of saying the wrong things. Don't feel like you have to know it all and have the most scripturally sound answer. Because in that wrestling process where you're really trying to dig out the meaning of Scripture, you're going to be wrong sometimes. But the Lord wants to use it and use you to grow. And so today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 26. Let's read it. When it was evening, He took His place with the 12, and while they were eating, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." And they became greatly distressed and began to say to Him one after another, "Surely not I, Lord." He answered, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Judas, who betrayed Him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." And He replied, "You have said so." This is the story of Jesus at the Last Supper, whenever He reveals to the rest of the disciples that there is one among them, there's one in their own ranks who's going to betray Him. They're going to turn Him over, and Jesus is going to be crucified and ultimately killed. You see, when we read this passage, we see betrayal, we see deception, we see lying, but we also see Jesus in such a place of peace, right? Whenever Jesus hears and whenever He knows and reveals that there's the one among them that's going to turn Him over, He isn't furious, He isn't angry, He doesn't try to justify Himself, He doesn't try to get out of it. No, what we see is that Jesus is moving forward in peace and security, following the Lord who guides His steps. So read this passage again in your small groups, and then talk about this question. How would I have acted in this story? Would you have been like Jesus, who wants to only follow the will of God? Would you have been like His disciples, saying, "Oh man, something's got to give, right? We can stop this. We don't have to take this." Would you have fought it? Would you have tried to be justified? Would you have even taken revenge? How would I have acted in this story?